Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everybody. I have the pleasure this morning to facilitate a roundtable discussion really dedicated to a core topic in this conference. So well-being of seniors, well-being of young people, future investments, how to reconcile time horizons. So what is the issue? When we talk about well-being, how do we measure it? How do we appraise it? Are there not more elaborate means of comparing well-being? What about well-being of seniors compared to the well-being of young people, especially when we note that in the heart of this health, economic and social crisis has an impact on generations. What was the situation before the crisis, and what is the situation during, after the crisis, and what is the place reserved for younger generations in this aging society? Which is continuing to age, and how to reconcile the well-being of these different generations. In particular, how can we conduct retirement policies that are sustainable in the face of this population aging without putting too much weight on the shoulders of the younger generations? So what about these future investments? Can we deploy measures that enables a harmonious society? And so to discuss this issue, I have several guests. The first guest who will open the discussion is Marco Viella from the OECD, from the Wide Center, Wellbeing, Inclusion and Sustainability and Opportunities, is going to present to us this research center, which is dedicated to the analysis of well-being at the OECD. Then I will hand the floor to Mr. Mathieu PERONA, who is Executive Director of the Observatory of Wellbeing of CEPREMAP, and who's going to talk about the presentation of the indicators, well-being indicators, subjective well-being indicators that have been researched on by the Observatory. Then I will hand the floor to Hervé BOULHOL, who's the economist at the OECD, to talk about retirement policies and talk about this confrontation between generations concerning this matter of retirement, sustainable retirement. And then we'll hand the floor to Hervé Lebrun, demographer, who's going to talk to us about the transformations of the age structure and how young people find a place in this aging society. And to conclude these discussions, I will be delighted to welcome as for a testimonial Eric JEANNEAU, who's the chairman of Union Mutualiste Retraite, who will be able to give his point of view and provide or shed light on what or provide another take on what has been said and give us some information concerning how individuals project their future, how they anticipate their retirement. And are people preparing for retirement? And does this imply particular investments? And then we will have a Q&A session. So if you will allow me, we're going to listen to you, Mr. MIRA. So the floor is yours. Hello, everybody. In 6 minutes, I'm going to try to relay 5 messages. If the conference would have been a few weeks ago, I would have been here under another capacity because I was in charge of statistics at the OECD, and now I'm an advisor for the Research Center, the WISE. Why is it important change? Because there's a shift in the research by OECD concerning aging, and we're embarking on a phase where we're looking at policies concerning aging. Now, the center has been set up and organized on the basis of 3 pre-existent units within the OECD, and the idea is to continue research that has been carried out for 10 years by OECD in this area. So it remarks the change from what are the indicators that we will need to be able to evaluate well-being to a new research question issue. In the case when if these indicators are available, how can we use them for defining policies? And the second thing I would like to insist on is that generally, what is our approach regarding a person's well-being? It's an approach, if you like, that is based on work that has been carried out within the Stupécène Commission that was set up by Mr. Sarkozy a certain amount of time. And I would like to insist on the multidimensional aspect of this research, because the approach is more an approach looking at the control panel rather than having a synthetic approach. Such as the Human Development Index. And there are a number of subjective indicators. So the notional framework that we use has a dimension which includes this notion of well-being, and therefore we've always insisted that this type of measurement has always led to, or type of benchmarking has provided information is not taken into account by more traditional, conventional indicators. We're not here to replace traditional indicators such as GDP or per capita earnings, but to complement these indicators. Another comment I would like to make concerning the nature of our approach is the focus on inequalities in the plural. And we really stress the importance of looking at inequality in every aspect of people's lives, which implies not just revenue, there's also life expectancy, skills and competencies, and to do this in a comprehensive manner which looks at the same time differences between people at the bottom or the top of the scale, as well as inequalities between groups. And this is important. And also to look at inequalities between different age brackets. And the last report was published in the month of March 2020. And an important part of this report on well-being focused on differences in well-being between young people or older persons. And when we look at such findings, the results are quite easy to predict. When elderly people have better salaries or income or participation in political life, but elder people don't do as well as young when it comes to being an active part of society, of having many ties with other members in society, ties with family. This multidimensional approach is one that we use also to look at the impacts of the COVID crisis. And we are now committed to conduct a more exhaustive study or comprehensive study on how well-being changes in these different areas or dimensions among different age brackets. And this goes beyond simply documenting risks, mortality risks associated with the crisis, because we know well that out of 8 persons impacted by the virus, among the people who under 50, practically no one will die. But for people who older than 70, the 116 out of 1,000 people will die. So these are major differences which are going to have different impacts in different aspects of life. And we also know that the impact on employment affects more young people. And we see this thanks to unemployment statistics. Now, the generational differences, and I would like here to leave you with a number of considerations which are not strictly focused on the retirement systems. Hervé is much more qualified than I am to talk about this, but I would like to highlight the fact that generally speaking, there is the notion of sustainability of development. And in our approach of sustainability of development, we've always insisted that we need to look at the impact between generations of different types of capital or assets. And these impacts can be positive or negative. It depends also on whether the generations concerned have activities which lead to reduction in revenues and lead them to invest or not, or to save or not. And this has more or less an impact on public debt. One aspect which is underlined or stressed in the report of the Commission that succeeded the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission was to look at the balance between the working population and the non-working population. There was a great... It looked at the way resources would use it. There's a logic of investment in future generations can increase public debt without necessarily reducing the net financial assets of individuals. So we can have a perspective which looks at both sides of the balance sheet, assets and liabilities, and looks at the whole or the result, the balance. Now, of course, there's a debt in terms of economic resources, but there are a number of resources that are not necessarily exchanged on the market. For example, we're increasing implicit debt or implied debt in nature, which is something which is going to be weighing more heavily on future generations. I will conclude here. I fear I may have gone beyond my allotted time. Thank you very much. You were very much very punctual and very succinct. It's very clear it was very interesting to hear about the research conducted by OECD, by the Commission. Now I'm going to go to Mathieu PERONA, who's going to talk to us about the type of ways that well-being is measured by the Observatory of Well-being. Thank you very much. As MIRA has very well explained, at the Observatory, we focus on the subjective well-being, the answers people give when we ask them the question, to what extent are you satisfied with your way of life? Do you feel that your life is, your well-being is improving? Do you feel safe or secure? And we have a number of questions which are regularly asked in different surveys by INSEE, and which at our level, every quarter, we look at this data and compile a report. As it has been said, these factors bring information that are not necessarily visible in the conventional, or thanks to conventional benchmarking indicators, because the scope that we are studying focuses on well-being of senior population compared to the rest of the population. The first thing we would say is that at an international level, when we ask people, well, are you satisfied with your life? You have a high point, which would be your point of departure of, let's say, the age of 20. It depends on point of entry of the survey. But generally speaking, at 20, and it goes down to a low point between 47 and 50, and then it goes back up again around about 55, 60 at the time of going into retirement, and then it stabilizes because it's caught up by health issues. We see this in a great deal in many countries that have gone through different economic and age structure events. So there's something that happens that is pretty universal, which concerns the different periods in people's lives. Now, in France, this shape that is less marked. There is a decline from the young age, but it does go up more. When we look more precisely what happens during the passage towards retirement, we do not have, or have very little, increased subjective well-being when you go into retirement from leaving a job. The exchange, or the higher salary that you had when you were employed, also the relationships or social ties, it's compensated by the fact that you have much more free time. Who have a major improvement in well-being at time of retirement to people who were in precarious job situation or unemployed just before they went into retirement. So this makes the index climb more sharply for this category. And if we compare the over 50s at a European level in France with other countries, and you do a double comparison between France and other countries, and then senior actives and retired people of comparable age, we realize that for a whole number of indicators, feeling of safety or security, the feeling that your life is meaningful, the feeling of solitude, loneliness, or depression, there's not much difference between working people and people who retire, but there's a subjective well-being which is not as good or is not what one would expect in regards of the standard of living in the country. Something that one would expect that would be a general index of well-being. And in France, it's this index, general index of well-being, is not as good as could be expected. And this is especially the case for the over 50-year-olds, independently of their status as retired or not retired. So we're working on how to understand exactly what is the reason for this, or what is the turning point. Now, one thing would be the question of confidence or trust. The answer generally, do you trust people? People say no. Or do you trust the institutions? Is something that is linked to the level of education of people. Whereas in France, with a great increase in graduates amongst young generations, And we have a level of trust, confidence in the young generations which is higher than at the older generations. So there is a gap or a difference in the representations, social representations and political representations in this regard. Another aspect that the study of well-being indicators has revealed is that indicators that are not measured by conventional indicators, that is the density of social relations or relationships concerning problems of loneliness, a certain lack of contact, which has an impact on subjective well-being. And the other aspect is the importance of mental health issues, which is a blind spot today in many health policies, because we're starting to look at mental health from a medical point of view only recently. So there's a certain time lapse or lagging behind in the statistics concerning this aspect of health. Now, I've come to the end of my allotted time. I'd like to insist that this is an area where we have a lot of things that we still need to research into, because the metrics enable us to give an evaluation of things that are very difficult to evaluate or appraise with traditional indicators. For example, things like cohabitation between young people and senior citizens. It's difficult to measure that with your conventional metrics. So we really need to have these subjective indicators of well-being will enable us to give an evaluation of what policies work well in terms of making people feel better in terms of social interaction and mental health. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mathieu. I see there's already a question that has been asked that I'm going to jot down, keep for later on. I'm going to hand the floor to Hervé BOULHOL from the OECD.
Oui,
so
bonjour
Hervé,
à tous.
Yes,
merci
hello everybody.
aux
Thank
organisateurs
you
pour l'invitation.
for
Donc, Nathalie
inviting
m'a
me.
demandé de
Nathalie
discuter de
asked me to
l'impact
talk
des réformes
about the
de
impact of
retraite
the
sur le
reform of
bien-être
the
des
retirement
seniors et le
system
bien-être des jeunes.
on the
Je vais commencer par le
well-being
bien-être des
of
seniors.
the
Les
senior
interventions précédentes,
population,
Marco, le
and I'll
travaux de
focus on the
l'OCDE
seniors.
avec Marco et Romina montre que, en fait, c'est un concept, le bien-être est un concept très large. Moi, je vais me concentrer sur trois dimensions. La première qui est pour améliorer le bien-être, ce qu'on avait étudié en 2017, qui est très clair dans les enquêtes, c'est qu'il faut permettre aux travailleurs qui atteignent l'âge de la retraite de partir progressivement, plutôt que de faire face à un choix binaire, soit on travaille, soit on reçoit une pension. Alors, c'est très clair dans les enquêtes, il y a un désir très fort à 40, 45 ans d'avoir cette retraite progressive. En fait, il y a très peu de gens dans tous les pays, pas seulement en France, qui ont recours. Et soit parce que ex post, finalement, les gens ont moins ce désir, soit parce que les politiques ne permettent pas cela. À nouveau, on a étudié en profondeur en 2017, mais le point important, c'est que pour mettre en place une retraite progressive qui ne pose pas de problème de conflit entre les générations, il faut respecter les deux dimensions sur lesquelles je vais me concentrer, qui sont un peu réductrices par rapport à ce qu'on a dit, et un peu terre à terre, donc j'en suis désolé, mais qui sont la durée passée à la retraite et le niveau de pension. Et donc, au premier abord, c'est assez clair. À nouveau, si on se concentre sur le bien-être des seniors, eh bien, le bien-être augmente avec la possibilité de départ à la retraite le plus tôt possible et avec le niveau de pension le plus élevé possible. Donc ça, c'est assez simple. Bien sûr, au niveau du système, il peut y avoir un conflit entre ces deux objectifs, ce qui pose des problèmes de questions en termes intragénérationnels et intergénérationnels. Alors, il faut être clair au niveau intragénérationnel, on peut avoir le degré de redistribution que l'on souhaite dans les systèmes en particulier à prestations définies, en fonction des choix politiques. En revanche, vouloir préserver une grande souplesse dans le choix du départ à la retraite implique, pour assurer l'équité intragénérationnelle, d'avoir un système de bonus-malus. Et le problème, c'est que donc disposer d'une souplesse totale n'est sans doute pas la meilleure politique au niveau first best dans le jargon des économistes. Car même si on ignore les conséquences négatives pour le système de retraite, pour l'économie plus généralement, il y a des erreurs de comportement qui sont faites et qui peuvent conduire à des départs prématurés et à des pertes de bien-être constatées a posteriori. Il y a donc des études qui mettent en évidence ce type de comportement actuel. D'où, même si on se limite au point de vue du bien-être des seniors, eh bien, il faut combiner un âge minimum de retraite et donc plus ou moins élevé, bien entendu, un système de bonus-malus et un niveau de dépenses. Et ça n'a échappé à personne que finalement, le système actuel en France peut présenter ce type de caractéristiques. Alors, poser la question en termes d'équité intergénérationnelle, c'est se demander évidemment si le bien-être des seniors ne s'opère pas au détriment des autres générations. Donc, l'équité intergénérationnelle veut dire que ça pose des contraintes sur l'âge minimum, sur le niveau de pension, et en particulier dans les systèmes par répartition. Mais alors, donc on a vu, je voudrais d'abord insister sur le fait que l'équité intergénérationnelle est un concept quand même qui est complexe. Il faut d'abord se mettre d'accord sur ce qu'on veut dire par génération. Et là, il ne faut pas mélanger des politiques qui favoriseraient certains groupes d'âge et des questions intergénérationnelles. C'est-à-dire que les jeunes d'aujourd'hui seront les moins jeunes de demain. Et si les politiques d'âge sont maintenues, alors elles sont peut-être inefficaces, elles sont discutables, mais en tout cas, si elles sont maintenues dans le temps, il n'y a pas de problème d'équité intergénérationnelle au sens de la génération. Donc, de ce point de vue-là, il est important d'avoir vraiment une approche de parcours de vie. Donc, ce qui est au cœur du sujet du point de vue de l'équité intergénérationnelle, ce n'est pas tant les politiques qui favoriseraient tel groupe d'âge, mais le risque que ces politiques ne soient pas cohérentes d'un point de vue intertemporel. Donc, c'est une application forte, alors qui est peut-être évidente pour tout le monde, mais l'application est quand même très forte, c'est qu'il faut qu'il y ait une viabilité financière du système de retraite. Il ne faut pas qu'on finance le système de retraite par de la dette. Alors, à nouveau, l'équité intergénérationnelle est un concept polysémique, Marco l'a dit, mais plusieurs critères peuvent être utilisés pour évaluer cette équité. Et malheureusement, il y a quand même différentes implications potentiellement selon qu'on retient tel ou tel critère. Mais il semble, on peut en débattre, il faut reconnaître que c'est vraiment un sujet de débat, mais il semble plus juste d'un point de vue normatif de viser des taux de remplacement qui sont stables au cours du temps, pour un profil de carrière donné, une proportion constante entre le temps qui est passé en période de travail et le temps qui est passé à la retraite, et des taux de cotisation constants, c'est-à-dire une part constante du salaire qui sert à financer la retraite, et en l'occurrence, dans les systèmes par répartition, à financer la retraite des retraités. Donc la question évidemment cruciale, c'est de savoir si on peut, s'il peut y avoir compatibilité entre ces trois objectifs, c'est-à-dire donc stabilité du remplacement, stabilité du partage entre temps de travail et retraite, stabilité des taux de cotisation. Alors la bonne nouvelle, c'est que lorsqu'on fait face à une amélioration tendancielle de l'espérance de vie, ces trois objectifs peuvent être atteints simultanément. Alors, therefore, the three objectives can be simultaneously reached, working on age parameters like age and modifying it by 2 months each time life expectancy.
gained treatment between 60 and 65 years old. So it's a simple principle, it's a rule of the 2/3, but in practical terms, it's more complex to implement. Unfortunately, from a demographic point of view, there are other changes in life expectancy, and these may have an impact on the pay-as-you-go retirement system, and therefore the trend of the overall employment is essential here. And also the fertility rate has an important role as well. So this 2/3 rule works when there is a renewal of generation, when the employment rates make up for all the figures that would be beyond the replacement rate. So for France, the situation is quite favorable in comparison with other European countries, even though we're slightly behind. And Hippolyte referred to the question of immigration. I'll go back to this. But if fertility rates are low, beyond 2.1, and therefore if there's no renewal of generation, in order to keep this replacement rate, we'll have to go beyond 2/3 or increase the level of subscription. And therefore, it is impossible, therefore, to reconcile the three objectives. From that point of view, Central and Eastern European countries or Southern European countries with a sharp decrease of active population will face very difficult problems.
C'est évidemment l'importance cruciale du point de départ. C'est-à-dire que pour les retraités actuels, les droits acquis ne peuvent pas être mis en question, sauf catastrophe, congrès, etc. Leur situation est très protégée, ce qui se comprend, il n'y a pas de problème là-dessus. Mais évidemment, si pour ces générations de retraités, les paramètres n'avaient pas été définis de façon équilibrée financièrement, eh bien, on se retrouve devant une impossibilité, tout simplement. C'est-à-dire qu'on ne peut pas remplir les trois objectifs et donc assurer l'équité intergénérationnelle pour les générations futures en particulier, de façon viable financièrement. Donc, il faut d'abord assurer, c'est ça qui est important dans le message en termes séquentiels, il faut d'abord assurer que les paramètres sont fixés de manière viable financièrement avant de pouvoir discuter et de pouvoir être en mesure d'assurer l'équité intergénérationnelle. Ça rejoint un tout petit peu dans la présentation de John Giannopoulos, l'idée de legacy tax, le fait de comment est-ce qu'on rembourse quelque chose si on a... Alors, c'est pas tout à fait ça, l'idée est comment est-ce qu'on rembourse la dette, entre guillemets, et qu'on se met en mesure de pouvoir assurer potentiellement l'équité intergénérationnelle.
Can we ensure proper intergenerational equity? And that will be my conclusion. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Hervé, for your presentation. That was very clear. And of course, we'll come back to this. The question of sustainable pension systems is absolutely essential for aging populations. Let me now turn to Mr. Hervé Lebras, who will say a few words about this demographic aging observed in our societies. Over to you, Mr. Lebras.
Si, bonjour à tous.
Well, good morning,
donc, je suis Hervé Lebras, je suis directeur d'études à l'École des hautes études en sciences sociales, en histoire et démographie, et fellow de Churchill College à Cambridge. Je voudrais d'abord insister sur la difficulté des projections démographiques. Juste un exemple, en 1994, l'INSEE prévoyait qu'il y aurait 60 millions de Français en 2050. En 2017, qui est la dernière projection, l'INSEE prévoit 73 millions de Français, soit presque un quart de plus. Il y a quand même là matière à réflexion. Quelles sont les causes de l'erreur? On a signalé il y a un instant la question de la fécondité, mais maintenant la question de la mortalité et une troisième que je vais indiquer dans un instant compte peut-être la mortalité. En fait, il y a un tassement des courbes de la mortalité. Vous savez qu'aux États-Unis, même, l'espérance de vie a tendance à diminuer récemment. Et en France, Le tassement est très net. J'avais conseillé d'ailleurs au moment de la réforme des retraites, la CFDT, pour insister sur ce point, puisque ça change les calculs du Conseil d'orientation des retraites. Et je dois dire que ça me donne encore plus raison avec l'épidémie. Alors, il ne faut pas non plus attendre beaucoup de choses de l'épidémie des retraites. Le calcul qui a été fait notamment par Michel Guillot pour la première vague, Michel Guillot est de l'Université de Pennsylvanie et avec Myriam INED, ils ont montré que la première vague ne ferait baisser, enfin, ne causerait une baisse de l'espérance de vie que de 1,5, un peu moins de 2 mois. Et donc, la seconde vague étant presque aussi forte, on peut dire qu'il y aura sans doute 0,4 années d'espérance de vie en moins, comme il y a 0,1 année de plus prévue en tendanciel. Vous voyez que la baisse sera modeste, mais il y aura baisse. Alors, le résultat sur la proportion de personnes âgées, je vais vous donner très rapidement les quelques chiffres que l'on a. Actuellement, en France, on a 20,8% de personnes qui ont plus de 65 ans, et la prévision pour 2050, notamment par l'INSEE, mais aussi par l'ONU, c'est 27,8%. Donc, c'est une augmentation nette. Ceci dit, quand vous regardez l'Allemagne, l'Allemagne est à 21,7% et elle irait à 31,3%. Ce qui est intéressant, c'est que l'Allemagne a 0,9% de plus que nous seulement. Or, l'Allemagne a eu 0,5 enfants de moins que nous pendant plus de 40 ans. Comment l'Allemagne s'en est-elle tirée? L'espérance de vie est la même. L'Allemagne s'en est tirée, je vais prononcer un mot qui fait toujours peur, par l'immigration. Il y a eu une très forte immigration en Allemagne. D'abord, des personnes qui venaient des anciens pays, des Allemands qui venaient des anciens pays de l'Est, ce qu'on appelle les environnements ethniques. Et maintenant, vous l'avez vu avec les réfugiés. Donc, il faut aussi intégrer les migrations dans le calcul démographique de la croissance. Actuellement, même en France, c'est assez faible, mais c'est quand même non négligeable. Donc, on peut penser que il y a au fond des ressources dans la manière dont on gérera la politique migratoire qui vont intervenir, qui vont faire avoir un effet sur la proportion de personnes âgées. Sur le point sur lequel on m'avait interrogé, qui était est-ce qu'il va y avoir des tensions entre générations? Alors là, c'est un grand classique aussi. Je pense qu'il n'y aura pas de tension, je vais vous dire pourquoi, mais qu'elle pourrait être suscitée au fond indirectement. Alors pourquoi il n'y en aura pas? Parce que au fond, la famille est devenue le lieu préféré de bonheur des Français. Beaucoup d'autres orateurs avant moi ont parlé de ces questions de bonheur, mais je rappelle que dans les enquêtes, c'est presque toujours la famille qui vient en tête. Par exemple, si vous prenez une belle enquête du Crédoc qui demandait de choisir parmi les 30 motifs de satisfaction, en tête venaient les enfants, 36%, la famille, 36% des personnes citaient les enfants, 30% la famille, 22% le travail, et 17% le couple. Bon, donc la famille est vraiment en tête. Ipsos Mori fait des enquêtes sur une trentaine de pays développés sur la proportion de personnes heureuses. Elle demande quelles sont les causes. Ce qui est intéressant, la santé vient en tête, citée par 52% des personnes. Juste après, c'est la famille, 48%. Et les enfants viennent en troisième, 45%. Donc il y a, si vous voulez, ce que font l'économiste et historien Albert Hirschman a appelé bonheur privé et malheur public. Et cette tension est très forte. D'ailleurs, je trouve que c'est tout à fait d'accord avec l'intervention de Mathieu PERONA. En France, il y a un très grand écart entre les opinions, les perceptions et la réalité. J'ai publié l'année dernière un livre sur la France qui s'appelait, le titre était « Se sentir mal dans une France qui va bien », qui soulignait justement à l'aide des eurobaromètres les différences entre les opinions des Français au sujet de leur situation et d'un grand nombre de thèmes, et puis non pas la réalité mais les faits ou les statistiques. Le livre a d'ailleurs, pour vous rassurer, parce que le titre est un peu olé olé, il a obtenu le prix spécial du jury du livre d'économie. Donc là-dedans, vous voyez qu'il y a une quelque chose qui est fond positif dans ce bonheur privé, et on pourrait penser qu'il n'y aura pas de problème gros entre les générations grave. Je pense qu'il risque d'arriver indirectement, comme je dis, je vais finir par là, mais en signalant quelques points que beaucoup d'entre vous connaissent. D'abord, un point politique. L'augmentation de la proportion de personnes âgées, c'est l'augmentation de leur poids électoral. Et d'autant plus qu'elles votent, leur taux d'abstention est nettement plus faible que les autres. Donc, c'est la tendance qu'il y aura à faire passer des lois qui seront des lois plus en faveur des personnes âgées que des autres. Et un second point, c'est la pauvreté. Il y a quand même eu une inversion fantastique en France entre 1970 et maintenant de la répartition par âge de la pauvreté. Maintenant, les personnes qui sont les moins pauvres, l'indice de pauvreté le plus faible en France, c'est les hommes de plus de 75 ans. Et le plus fort, c'est les jeunes qui sont entre 18 et 24 ans. Et c'est seulement la pauvreté en termes de revenus. Quand on regarde en termes de patrimoine, les écarts sont encore plus importants. Donc, là-dedans, il y a des éléments de tension réels très forts, même si, comme vous l'avez vu, l'opinion sur la famille est bonne. Et puis, je pense qu'il y aura des éléments de tension politique. J'étais amené notamment à regarder les intentions de vote au moment des municipales selon l'âge. Et il y a vraiment des différences extraordinairement fortes dans les intentions de vote, beaucoup plus fortes que dans les années précédentes. Par exemple, les jeunes sont très nombreux à vouloir voter, à prétendre qu'ils allaient voter pour les écologistes. Et là, la différence entre jeunes et âgés est très grande. Même différence aussi sur hommes et femmes. Les femmes sont d'ailleurs beaucoup plus portées sur l'écologie que les hommes. Mais tout ça peut jouer, va jouer en termes de tension entre générations, mais ça ne sera pas direct, qu'il y a cet amortisseur qui est la famille.
But there will be shock absorbers, and the shock absorber mainly is family. Thank you for your attention. Well, thank you. Thank you for your very interesting presentation on demographic development and potential tensions. This is what we have observed in our harmonious aging societies. And all the links, the correlations with the political questions. And now over to our guest, Eric JEANNEAU, who will share with us his opinion on the previous presentations. He will highlight what seems quite interesting to him, and then we'll answer some questions. I already noted some of these. Please, Eric JEANNEAU, over to you. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm focusing and the president of a company working on the saving and retirement. So I will explain which are the perceptions and the resources available to try and reconcile timelines, because that was the original question for this panel discussion. Well, I believe that there is a commonality between generations. Referring to what all our speakers said, it may be difficult to project oneself towards a desirable horizon. The horizon is a way to escape, but the closer you get to it, the less you feel close to it, actually. And it is something that is really visible. The society of longevity is something that modifies the time projection of all people, no matter the generation. We're also part of a society where the future is seen as uncertain or something that is very difficult to comprehend. So we have a difficulty to look into the future, and that's true for everyone, every kind of generation. In the first roundtable, Christian de Boissieu explained that it was interesting indeed to see how people, depending on their generations, had preferences for the present or for the future. For us, what we can observe in our own business is, well, there are contrasted reactions in this difficulty to project oneself. For the young people, retirement seems quite far away and quite uncertain in a way. This is what Mr. BOULHOL used to say about this notion of perception of intergenerational equity. It is first a matter of how sustainable you consider the pension system. That's why it is necessary to prepare the system, and younger people anticipate and have specific saving schemes to prepare for retirement. Others just refuse to limit themselves financially, to restrict their immediate consumption. They would adopt other saving systems because the situation is uncertain. But something new, this is something that we see with older people when they retire, actually. It used to be automatic. You would reach the age of retirement and then you would use your pension entirely. But today you have more contrasted situations. Some people have a projection of their old days and end of life, which is very strong. That's why they keep on saving for retirement, even though they're already retired, so that they can get additional revenues to face the risk of dependence. And the other way around, there are also more important people who tend to underestimate the life expectancy once they retire. Maybe this is because of what Mr. Lebras said. Life expectancy after retirement are less progressing somehow, and people are more and more aware of this fact. That's why some people say, okay, let's enjoy time now, and our reflect is to collect the capital and to retire earlier than originally planned, with the risk of spending all the money before we reach 75 or 80, even though life expectancy is much higher than this. So how can we reconcile all horizons? Well, we must admit this fact. Perceptions are somehow not so different from, And in fact, we want to make sure that intergenerational solidarity get stronger, since all generations must live together, and each generation can definitely contribute to a shared vision. So there are several ways to go with an investment policy that will be responsible, and therefore we try to offer investments that will project society in a future of well-being, with investments that are focusing on facilities that will be required to create bonds, community bonds, but also bonds through new technologies. For instance, we do invest on the development of the optic fiber in rural areas with people that are isolated, whether young or older. But we also try to support people and retired people, making sure that they understand how to work with new technologies. And in this work, we do work with associations that help us. Another example, we do have focused on housing, investment on housing, because it is a problem for young people, students in particular, but also for older people, senior citizens. Jean-Pierre Grimaud was referring to this. There is a reflection to trigger on the senior residences, retirement homes, just to make sure that they're more integrated in society and to create some sort of intergenerational residences. And lastly, we also need to think, and I believe that to do it, these kind of symposiums are important, just to make sure that senior citizens do have the will and means to invest in society. It is important for them just to create social bonds and to keep these, but also for other generations. There was an example that was really striking during the first COVID wave. In fact, we asked young teachers who had just retired, just for them to help using new technologies, young children or children that were who were all out of school, who couldn't learn properly through digital technologies. And these young retired teachers did answer because they wanted to play a role in society and they wanted to show that they could be useful. So they remain active in society. This led us to the idea of carrying out an in-depth survey, especially with teachers and professors who are about to retire, who just retired, just to identify the social activities they still have and what impact this can have on their well-being, on their social fabric, and also on the well-being of populations they interact with. And I believe that, as Mr. PERONA put it, that with this kind of activities, we will then be able to increase the well-being of people who just retire and probably overall well-being of society. And I believe that we can have the proper resources thanks to the surveys that we carry out and spread the word. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. JEANNEAU, for your contribution. I do thank you for sharing this experiment that took place during the lockdown. And you know, this notion of social activity, social bonding is essential to our chair. And we'll come back to this question today because it is a way, of course, to boost the well-being of senior citizens who remain active, who remain involved, who feel useful. And it's also a way to increase the collective well-being. Young people, students and pupils that are underprivileged, and it's a way to prevent school dropout. So this has a very positive impact on collective well-being. These are part of fundamental elements just to make sure that retired people go happy. There are a few questions that were asked. Maybe I could start. A question to Mathieu PERONA. Are there impact studies of public policies on the subjective well-being of older citizens? Mathieu PERONA, can you answer the question? Well, that's a very good question indeed. It is a field where the assessment, rigorous assessment, it is very difficult to conduct a proper assessment of such policies. These are methods that recently spread, but it would be good to have a group that would be measured, another group that would not be measured. To say, okay, you are entitled, first group is entitled to this kind of support towards retirement, but the other group will not be entitled to it. What we did today are comparisons between groups that within a sector, within a company, benefited from specific incentives and other did not benefit from such incentives. So what we can see is that people who do benefit from incentives have levels of satisfaction that are significantly higher than the others who do not benefit from such incentives. But in fact, it is the people who initially were most satisfied, who decided to continue the work, or people who had projects after retirement and who were able to reconcile retirement with specific projects that benefited these incentives. So our presumption still is that incentives are quite beneficial to people who are willing and able to make the most of these. Right. Another question. There are technical glitches. Question to Mr. Lebras. Demographic pressure, is this desirable? The question is about the demographic growth. What is the impact of it on ecological issues and the question of the management of natural resources?
Oui, d'accord. Oui, non, c'est une très vaste question. Il y a encore une trentaine d'années, c'est le thème était croissance économique, croissance démographique. On n'est jamais arrivé à trancher. Donc, de ce point de vue-là, laissons de côté. Sur l'écologie, c'est compliqué parce que, bien entendu, l'augmentation de la population mondiale est défavorable aux questions climatiques. Mais en même temps, cette augmentation est surtout dans les pays, comme vous le savez, les plus développés. Or, l'augmentation, je dirais, de la pollution, l'augmentation des émissions de CO2. Actuellement, la partie du monde, il n'y a plus d'explosion démographique d'abord, il faut bien voir les choses, il y a simplement quelques hotspots. Et l'un d'entre eux qui est le plus inquiétant, c'est le Sahel. Ce n'est pas énormément de monde, mais le pays champion en fécondité qui est le Niger, actuellement, c'est 7,3 enfants par femme. Les Nigériens sont, le Niger, c'est quand même un petit pays sahélien, il est grand par la surface, mais petit par ses moyens. C'est actuellement 22 millions d'habitants. En 2050, selon les Nations Unies, ça sera 72 millions d'habitants, plus que l'Allemagne. Donc là-dedans, il y a un risque qui n'est pas du tout un risque démographique, qui est un risque, qui n'est pas du tout un risque climatique, qui est un risque politique de déstabilisation d'une partie de l'Afrique notamment. Donc les questions de population, je crois qu'il faut les remettre justement sous cet angle-là. C'est pas parce que les Français font un peu moins d'enfants ou les Allemands un peu moins d'enfants que ça changera grand-chose du point de vue de la population dans son ensemble. Ça changera quelque chose si leurs attitudes vis-à-vis de la consommation changent. En revanche, démographiquement, c'est ce qui se produira dans le Sahel, dans l'Afrique équatoriale et dans la petite partie Afghanistan-Pakistan qui sera essentielle.
That would be essential in demographic terms. Well, thank you so much. There is a technical glitch with Nathalie CHUSSEAU. One question for Hervé BOULHOL. We didn't mention the need to install a progressive retirement system, but for difficult works, do you have any particular comment to make about the arduousness of works and therefore people who need to retire earlier because of harder work? Don't you think that this measure are not necessary to ensure a proper level of well-being?
Si je peux me permettre, la question est vache. Parce que ça mêle deux choses qui sont horriblement compliquées.
La
pénibilité, ça l'est. Et la retraite progressive, c'est pas évident. Mêler les deux, là, c'est vraiment un peu question. Et sur la pénibilité, c'est une vraie question sérieuse. Il n'y a pas de pays qui ont réussi à résoudre clairement la situation. Vous connaissez le cas de la France. Effectivement, il faut essayer de définir des critères, mais très rapidement, on entend le patronat qui dit que c'est horriblement compliqué, et je crois que ça l'est. Pour mettre en œuvre, c'est compliqué d'avoir des critères objectifs pour pouvoir mettre en œuvre. Donc oui, c'est un vrai sujet. Il n'y a pas de pays qui ont trouvé de recette. Alors nous, on peut dire facilement, oui, évidemment, comme l'Autriche le fait, c'est une question qui doit être évaluée au niveau individuel. C'est-à-dire que si la personne n'est pas en capacité en termes de santé de continuer le travail, là, bien sûr, il doit y avoir des pensions d'invalidité qui font le pont avec les pensions de retraite. Et donc, ça doit être estimé au niveau individuel. Mais lorsqu'on dit ça, pour le principe, il n'y a pas de problème. En pratique,
we see that in reality,
déjà un peu trop
we
tard,
do not talk about prevention because then it's already too late. So when we tend to say OECD is that what matters is to act before we reach such a state. And we focus on prevention policies. Some countries do not do it such a thing. And we need therefore to improve working conditions. There were huge improvements that were made in terms of working conditions for people.
Les nouvelles technologies vont
permettre maybe will help us make new progress. This question of job hardness is very tricky. We did not find any panacea. And if you reconcile this with the progressive retirement system, with 40 different schemes and so on and so forth, it's quite terrible. Okay, sorry for that terrible, tricky question, and thank you for your answer. There is one more question about something we didn't talk about. That's women. Women who retire. Are there important differences between men and women in terms of subjective well-being? Bearing in mind that women retire earlier than men, and they usually take care of older relatives as soon as they retire. So that's the question of carers and women carers. Are there such studies about the subjective idea of well-being for all people with significant differences between men and women? I don't know who would like to answer, Mathieu PERONA maybe, or Mr. MIRA could tell us about it. Are there such studies about differences in terms of well-being, whether subjective or actual feeling of well-being between men and women who retire?
Okay, it's going to be very difficult to cross the age criterion and the gender criterion. Usually, our conclusion is that there is no significant impact linked to the age. However, we know very well, as you said, that women have a longer life expectancy once retired and may end up on their own. Is it a burden? Yes, because, well, they have a burden because they tend to care for the other members of the families. And all these elements suggest that women might be faced with very huge challenges because of their life expectancy. I wanted to make a more general remark related to this work hardship. According to me, we should not oppose the question of fairness between generations without forgetting the differences within a given generation. And those differences are significant. Hervé conducted a project some years ago at the OECD, Aging Inequality, that was the title. And what the outcome of this article struck me. Even with a life expectancy at 65 years of age, between the most educated people and the less educated people, there is a gap by 6 years for men. Of course, education is not really difficult work, but in the light of this difference, it is very important, therefore, that when there is a reform policy, we should not forget the differences between or within a generation. In the US, we know that those differences are getting greater and greater, and we have to be able in politics to take on board this and to have an equilibrium within generations. Okay, thank you very much. Our time is now out. Thank you very much for having attended this panel discussion on a very interesting topic, and we will meet you another time, and I hope that you're going to attend this very interesting day. Thank you to you all.